We want to end this war before winter?
Russia must make a deal.
He said that he is ready to once again return to facilitating the resolution of the Ukrainian crisis.
We are all waiting for one single word. It's over. And now, an insider report appears in the Western information space. Ukraine and the United States are in contact every day and are developing a clear two-stage plan to put the war on pause before winter. And it all started after the G7 summit. It was there, behind the scenes, that talks about negotiations grew louder again and about the fact that it's time to bring Moscow to the table. Moreover, Donald Trump himself spoke about this publicly.
Listen, Russia needs to make a deal. Russia has lost a huge number of people, and so has Ukraine.
It would seem that this is the long-awaited signal. Volodymyr Zelensky did not stay on the sidelines either. He also clearly outlined what Ukraine is currently betting on.
We want to end this war by winter through diplomacy. Of course, this is very important. And through pressure on Russia. But we understand who we are dealing with. Putin means war.
But the joy was short-lived because official Kyiv responded briefly and harshly, "This is a false fabrication. Nothing of the sort exists." So what is it really? Are these real secret agreements being hidden from us or just another media manipulation? And why are influential global magazines raising this issue right now? Let's skip the speculation and stick to the facts. What is actually being discussed behind closed doors? Why is Ukraine forced to deny this? And why are analysts convinced that before true silence comes, we will have to go through the most difficult stage? All about this. Don't switch channels. Let's start with what exactly The Economist wrote. The impetus was the meeting of G7 leaders in Evian, France. After that, the magazine published an article saying that the G7 had slightly opened the window for diplomacy. And in this context, some details emerged. According to the publication, Ukraine and the US are in contact literally every day. At the same time, unofficial negotiations with Russia have also resumed. And among the options being discussed is the same phased plan to first limit hostilities within a strip of 50 to 70 kilometers on both sides of the front, and only then move on to a broader agreement, likely with security guarantees for Ukraine and monitoring of the ceasefire. But journalists immediately warn against illusions. The article explicitly states that one should not expect Putin to voluntarily give up the war. On the contrary, he will use any new turn of events or even a temporary ceasefire solely as a pause to build up his forces and continue the offensive. In other words, even the authors of the plan do not believe that Moscow is playing fair. And there's another important detail. The Economist refers to a high-ranking Ukrainian official who says that Moscow is unlikely to take any steps before October. This month is mentioned for a reason. It is in the fall that the United States will hold midterm elections. It seems that Putin wants to wait for their results in order to gain a stronger bargaining position in exchange for supporting Trump. So even the most optimistic scenario is definitely not about the coming days. And in Washington itself, the mood has indeed changed a bit. Ukrainian strikes on oil refineries and on Moscow are also being noticed. U.S. Army Secretary Dan Driscoll stated that the integration of the Ukrainian battlefield has justified the integration of the American Army, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth admitted that America has learned a lot from how Ukraine uses drones. Now, Ukrainians are no longer seen as supplicants. And now back to the very turning point we started with. The Economist wrote that Zelensky is allegedly ready to consider this model and even sees it as the shortest path to ending the war. However, sources in the Ukrainian government do not categorically deny it. They assure that there is no idea of a limited truce in Kyiv, nor has there ever been, and they call the publication itself a typical false leak. A logical question arises: if such an idea truly does not exist, then why write about it at all? And this is where things get most interesting. Political analyst Ruslan Bortnik explains it this way in a comment to Focus. In the near future, Trump's special envoys, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, are expected to arrive in Kyiv and Moscow. And perhaps with these statements about freezing, Europe is simply showing through the media that the positions of the EU, the US, and Ukraine have become closer. In other words, this is informational groundwork ahead of a new round of negotiations. Here, context is important. For a long time, the US adhered to the Anchorage Principles, the agreements discussed at the Trump-Putin summit, which essentially called for the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Donetsk region, a move that would be tantamount to capitulation for Ukraine. And after the G7 summit, Ukrainian media began to write that the London wind had swept away this spirit of Anchorage. They claimed that the West had abandoned these conditions. But political analyst Andrei Zolotaryov categorically disagrees with this. He emphasizes that nowhere have American representatives said that their position on Ukraine has changed. The Americans have not officially spoken at all about freezing along the front line. Therefore, we were presented with wishful thinking as reality, and the rumors about the disappearance of the spirit of anchorage are exaggerated. And here, the most direct confirmation comes straight from Moscow itself, because on June 19th, Lavrov essentially put all the dots on the i's himself.
President Trump has now said that he is ready to once again return to his efforts to facilitate the resolution of the Ukrainian crisis. We are ready for this. We continue to firmly uphold our steadfast position of commitment to those various potential pathways toward a diplomatic resolution that the American side formally presented and proposed to our delegation during the high-level summit held in Anchorage.
Do you hear that? In other words, Moscow remains faithful to those paths of resolution that the American side proposed to it in Anchorage. Russia has not deviated from these agreements at all, which fully confirms Zolotaryov's words. The conditions have not disappeared. These are our expectations, not the reality of the negotiations. Although something in the Kremlin's rhetoric has indeed changed, and Bortnik describes this very accurately. He says that what has appeared is not even a window, but just a small vent. What is the essence? Previously, Moscow put forward clear territorial demands. Withdraw troops from Donetsk region, period. This is easy to check. Either they withdrew or they didn't. But now, according to the political analyst, the situation is completely different.
Now from Lavrov, we hear extraterritorial conditions, the rights of Russian speakers, the rights of the Orthodox Church.
And this is a fundamentally different story because unlike troop withdrawal, ensuring the rights of Russian speakers or believers is a complex and controversial issue. Ukraine insists that these rights are not being violated because it is implementing European legislation. It is almost impossible to confirm or refute this, and therefore this creates a space for dialogue. And here is how Bortnik summarizes this situation verbatim.
Perhaps a small opening has appeared, not even a window but just a vent, for negotiations ahead of this visit by Vitkovich and Kushner. But the prospects for peace this year still look very shaky.
But to avoid any illusions, it's worth hearing what Lavrov says when he's not trying to sound diplomatic. Recently, he wrote an article that was prepared for the publication Politico. Europe, but the editorial team refused to publish it at the last moment. So it was posted on the website of the Russian Foreign Ministry, and the tone there is completely different. In it, Lavrov writes that the real goal of Europe is not peace, but to save the Zelensky regime and preserve a foothold against Russia. He claims that Europeans want to freeze the conflict without addressing its causes, to deploy a coalition of willing troops, and to buy time until the year 2030. And he cites a cynical quote from the head of the Belgian General Staff, saying that Europe still has a few years left thanks to the blood of Ukrainians who are buying this time for them. And Lavrov's conclusion is direct and undiplomatic. We consider Europe a party to the conflict, interested in Russia's defeat. Keep this contrast in mind. One face for the cameras and for Trump showing readiness for a settlement, another in the article for their own people. And here is the main question. Are there any real prerequisites at all for the war to stop this year? Zolotaryov answers soberly, not yet. His logic is simple and stated verbatim as follows.
In diplomacy, parties sit down at the negotiating table when one side runs out of resources. And what resources? Money, weapons, and soldiers.
As long as neither side is critically lacking these, the war continues, and there are currently no prerequisites for Putin to weaken. Lines of Russians waiting for gasoline will not turn into political protest. Moreover, he warns against euphoria over strikes on Moscow. I quote, "We see effectiveness when the informational and propaganda component outpaces the military. Unfortunately, the situation at the front is far from rosy. We are losing territory." And he adds, "In response to attacks on the Russian capital, Ukraine is already being threatened with strikes." Therefore, his forecast for the coming months is not so much a freeze, but rather an escalation, according to him.
In the coming months, perhaps we will see some kind of turning point after 2 or 3 months of escalation. A turning point is some grand sacrifice that will force the sides to change their positions.
In other words, no one will just sit down at the table simply because they want to. And there is another mechanism which Bortnik explains that is very unpleasant. Remember the Russian-Chinese initiatives for a ceasefire in 2022 to 2023. At that time, Ukraine perceived them as a sign of Russia's weakness. And now everything is working in reverse. Now, when Ukraine starts talking about peace, Moscow sees this not as a willingness to settle things, but as an admission of Ukrainian weakness. Hence his key question: how can Moscow be convinced to abandon its sense of strategic advantage if neither Russia nor China managed to convince Ukraine itself of its own weakness in 2023? And the sanctions that Europe has just extended are working, but slowly. Russia is managing to adapt. China has not joined the sanctions and has not stopped trading. There is an effect, but it is delayed. Against this backdrop, Zelensky's position after the Ramstein meeting and the Ukraine-EU Council summit in Brussels was that Ukraine is determined to end the fighting before winter. But there is also a purely practical side. Zelensky made it clear, if the war drags on into the winter, the country will need gas, diesel, energy equipment, and at least 300 missiles for air defense systems. Remember this number, because this is the real price of having something to protect the skies over the cities this winter. Now let's be honest about the two sides of a freeze. The pros: fewer losses, a break for the economy and energy system, time to build up our own weaponry, and fewer risks for EU integration. But the downside is just as real. A pause also gives Russia a break. The Kremlin will get time to rebuild its army, will effectively secure the occupied territories for itself, and will be able to declare that it has achieved its goals, while the world's attention will gradually shift away from Ukraine. And here is the most important thing. According to media reports, people close to the president have even described the Kremlin's plan in the event of a freeze to push Ukraine toward elections, split society from within, and through this internal fragmentation quietly achieve what could not be accomplished on the battlefield. For Moscow, a pause is not an abandonment of its goals, but a change of tools. By the way, history here already has a troubling rhyme. Back in March 2025, Ukraine agreed to the US proposal for an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. Ukraine agreed, but Russia did not. And this is worth remembering every time someone says that it is Ukraine that does not want peace. Zolotaryov himself, by the way, explains why there is so much talk about peace right now.
The mood in society is rather gloomy, and people need to be given hope for a quick end to the hostilities. So part of these statements, it's not about diplomacy, but about supporting people.
And two final points that bring us back from the world of diplomacy to the ground. Because while some are talking about peace and quiet, others are preparing for the opposite. After all the meetings, Zelensky separately warned Russia may intensify missile and drone strikes and urged people not to neglect shelters. And on the Russian side, Stati Duma deputy Alexei Zhuravlyov, after yet another massive drone attack on Moscow, publicly called for strikes on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, on bridges, tunnels, railway stations, in other words, deliberately targeting things used by ordinary people. So let's sum things up honestly. Those 50 kilometers of silence we started with still exist only on paper, in a magazine article, and in backroom discussions. Kyiv rejects this idea. Moscow, in words, claims to support a settlement, but in articles for its own people, it writes about a bridgehead and the blood of Ukrainians. And the experts, both Bornik and Zolotaryov, agree on one thing. The window is ajar, but for now it lets in cold, not warmth. And the most likely scenario for the coming months is not peace, but yet another round of escalation before any serious talks can take place. Whether this small window will become a real opening depends on who runs out of money, weapons, and people first. And that's what you should watch more closely than the loud headlines. If this video helped you put everything in order, please support it with a like. It really helps the channel. Subscribe, because this story will definitely develop further in the coming weeks. And write in the comments, do you believe in a freeze along the front line this year, or is it just talk again to give people hope? See you in the next episode.